Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the second talk in our Door County Library Historic Preservation Month series. Each May, preservation groups, businesses, and civic organizations across our country celebrate historic preservation and the impact it makes in our communities. Our speaker this afternoon will be sharing with us a project which perfectly demonstrates that community impact. We're very excited to welcome Beth Renstrom, the Executive Director of the Sturgeon-Based Historical Foundation Greenery Project, to share with us the history and the future of an iconic Sturgeon Bay building. A little housekeeping first. Please remain muted during the presentation. There will be a Q&A period after the presentation is finished, so please feel free to share any questions you have in the chat, and we'll do everything we can to get to all of them. Without further ado, take it away, Beth.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Laura, for having us come and talk about the granaries and our Door County Granary project. Truly appreciate the opportunity to share some of my knowledge. And I know that there's a lot of people out there that have personal experiences with the granary, personal history when it was operating. And I'd love to hear from you as part of this whole project. I have been following the history of this granary for a while. I am by no means an expert in all of this information, but I have been able to be involved in some extensive and deep research regarding the granary project. And as a part of that process, I've found that there's really an interesting, multifaceted story that is one of the reasons that our granary is so special and something that we want to preserve. So I'm going to start with just a brief history of granaries. It'll give us a base to work from on why this granary, the Teweles and Brandeis granary, also known as the Door County Granary, is an important example of architecture and function that is worthy of preservation. And I'll share some of the family history, how they built their American dream with the granary. And then granary information about the Teweles and Brandeis granary itself, and give you a preview of the award-winning design of our vision for the granary as it becomes a viable part of our community for the future. So for thousands of years, grain has been really central to human existence. And the question of how to store food from one harvest to the next has been a question for people for thousands of years. We've only had what are considered modern preservation techniques like canning and freezing, since like kind of post-medieval. And the food supply is truly vital for the survival of human society. So really, how did ancient societies go about keeping their food safe? Well, the answer was in granaries, by building granaries. So Kevin Nielsen is a granary advocate. And one of the things that he says is that granaries are a critical part of life for any agrarian society. A good harvest only keeps the farmer alive if it's preserved until the next is ready. Because of differences in local climates, available building materials, and cultural aesthetics, these structures develop into unique styles, each a signature of the culture that created it. The wide variety of granaries around the world is an often overlooked expression of human cultural diversity. So let's take a look at a little bit of that diversity. Granaries have evolved over time, and you can see some examples of those. The earliest evidence of granaries has been found in a recent excavation, recent being the last 20 years, near the Dead Sea in Jordan. These excavations have provided really strong evidence that granaries existed as far back as like 11,000 BC, when people were still gathering grains, not even growing them themselves. They were also critical to the evolution and the development of agricultural villages, the ability to be able to have and store grain to feed your local population, and have that all in one place. So that's when agriculture and villages really started to develop, like 9,000 plus years ago. The early construction was usually very simple. So you can see in all these examples from 122 AD, a part of a granary that's left in Hadrian's Wall, to 19th century Austria. There was a vented storeroom raised off the ground. It kept grains dry and away from any vermin or any bugs as much as possible. The grain was dried and usually manually loaded into a granary, and it could be a really laborious job. It was usually done on a small scale. For thousands of years, granaries were built this way, and they were built to feed a local population. And that was how it was up until about the mid-1800s. Joseph Dart and Robert Dunbar invented the modern grain elevator, and that was invented in the United States. An example of that is our Teweles and Brandeis grain elevator. So as you can see here, that was built in 1901. So the modern grain elevator it's a type of granary. So we still call it a granary. It's just a grain elevator, a type of granary. It was invented in 1843 in Buffalo, New York. As I said earlier, Joseph Dart was a merchant. He hired an engineer to help him. He had an idea of what to do, and Robert Dunbar was the engineer. It was truly an American invention that revolutionized the heart of the food industry around the world, shaping it into what it is today. Be that good or bad. But think of going from like the abacus to the computer. The granary had previously manual labor. You had to move the grain into the bins. People were on ladders, stairways, pulley systems. And he introduced a mechanized belt and bucket conveyor that lifted the grain from the storage bins in the granary, eliminating that need for grains to be transported by hand. So grain elevators could do in 1 hour what it had previously taken 3 men to do in 1 day. Plus, it enabled economies of scale. So the capacity of these new grain elevators were huge. The Teweles and Brandeis grain elevator could hold up to 30,000 bushels of grain. There were 2 types of grain elevators. There were smaller elevators that were called country elevators. People locally would bring grain and have that stored and transported from there by rail usually to a terminal elevator. So there was a country elevator and the terminal elevator. Country elevator was local, and that transferred the grain to a terminal elevator where usually at a port or a seaside that could then transport the grain literally around the world. These terminal or shuttle elevators could hold millions of bushels of grain. Our grain elevator, the Teweles and Brandeis Granary, is a rare example of both a country and a terminal elevator. So it was both. It served as both. It wasn't a huge one. It was big for its time. But local farmers, both from the north of the county and the south, brought their grain directly to the granary. And then it would be could be locally distributed from there by rail. So there was the rail line that was running next to it, or it was also shipped to other areas of the country. At one time, grain was shipped to California to aid earthquake victims from the San Francisco earthquake. And there were also shipments of peas that were sent to Cuba. So this ability to store and distribute large amounts of grain enabled the United States to really quickly become the breadbasket to the world. So 2 very prominent historians have said that the grain elevator, or the invention of the grain elevator, is the most important yet least acknowledged invention in the history of American agriculture. If not, in the history of America itself, given the central role that agriculture has played in transforming the USA into a superpower. So pretty important things going on here with the invention of the grain elevator. So how does it work? Essentially, the farmer would drive his wagon into the grain elevator loaded with grain. The wagon would be weighed, and then the grain would be unloaded, usually somehow tipped out of, the wagon would tip up and the grain would unload into a bin in the boot of the granary, which was either below the floor or below the wagon if a ramp was kind of built up for the wagon to go up. Then the wagon was weighed again empty. So this was how they knew how much grain the farmer had delivered, and essentially then how much he was going to be paid for his crop. So the grain was tested. It was tested for dryness, for quality, and then based on those results, the grain would be lifted from the boot via that belt and bucket conveyor that you can see in the middle of this picture to the top of the granary for distribution to one of the bins. And it was stored there until it was distributed by either ship or by rail. This cross-section shows just 4 of the bins. The Teweles and Brandeis granary had 20 bins. 19 of those bins held grain, and then there was one that was for the conveyor and then also for the man lift. So someone could get up to the top if they needed to move any of the chutes or fix something up on the distributor floor or head house. All right, so how did this, sorry, were you guys not seeing that picture? Hopefully, sorry.
We see it, all right.
Okay, great. So just that's the picture of the granary, of how it works. There is a great, I just want to take a moment to promote, there's a great video on YouTube. It was put out by the Canadian Film Board that actually has a video of how this worked back at that time. So very interesting, and I would recommend anyone to go and watch that. It's about 15 minutes video. So how did this new technology, really that revolutionized the grain industry around the world, enable the American dream right here in Sturgeon Bay? So obviously it starts with Mr. Teweles and Mr. Brandeis, who were 2 immigrants from Prague that meet in America to start building their lives. All right, so in 1832, Moses Teweles is born in Prague. When he is 16 years old, there's a revolution. I didn't realize this, but Czechoslovakia at that time was still pretty much a feudal society. Very few people owned land. Primarily, it was the elite that owned the land, and people would contract to work on that land and get paid. So there's a revolution. It doesn't succeed, but it does weaken the system of feudalism. That same year, 1948, Wisconsin becomes the 30th state of the United States. I'd have to believe that revolution had a lot of impact on Moses, as he was a 16-year-old boy at that time. Maybe he participated in, maybe it was going on around him. But a few years later, in 1854, he and 2 of his brothers immigrate to America at a time when most people didn't travel 5 miles beyond their hometown. They take weeks to reach Bremen, Germany, where they board a ship and they go on an 8 to 10 week journey across the sea to America. They end up spending a little bit of time in New York, but eventually they travel to Wisconsin, to the area known as Little Bohemia, which is the area between Milwaukee and Green Bay. So a lot of immigrants from Bohemia, some of my own family included, immigrated into that area. In 1860, he appears on the Sheboygan census. So at this point, he is a merchant, listed as a merchant. He has a wife, he has 2 children. His net worth is listed at $300, which is about $10,000 today. But interestingly enough, they also have a live-in domestic servant from Prussia, a 16-year-old girl. So as the years go by, the US Civil War happens. There is the devastating Peshtigo fire. In 1874, Sturgeon Bay becomes a village, and Moses is moving slowly north. He had a shop in Manitowoc for a while, but by 1880, he is now listed on the Algoma census. And he has a new wife. His previous wife had died, and they have 4 more children, including his daughter, Fanny, who is now 14. So enter Isidore Brandeis. So Isidore is born a few years later than Moses. He's born in Prague as well in 1860, so 28 years after Moses. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is still in flux. There's still, it's 20 years after the revolution. There's still political unrest and upheaval. Their parliamentary systems have been established, but it's really still, there's a king. The Austrians hold all the power, and Czechoslovakian citizens have little control still over their own fate. So at the age of 17, Isidore immigrates to America. He also goes to the area known as Little Bohemia, and he lands in Milwaukee. I wasn't able to find out for sure if he had family that was already there, but he becomes a merchant in Milwaukee, starts working in a store, and then eventually has his own store. Does he meet the Teweles family then? Not sure. Moses Teweles often had dealings in Milwaukee. He had been in Milwaukee at one point. Isidore's uncle at one point had a store in Manitowoc, and Moses Teweles also had a store in Manitowoc at that same time. So we're not sure when they connected, but somewhere along the way, the families interacted, and Isidore meets and falls in love with Moses's daughter, Fanny Teweles, and they get married in 1888. So he's 28 years old. He has his own store in Milwaukee. Fanny goes with him, and they settle in Milwaukee, and they're there for a few years. Meanwhile, things are still happening in Sturgeon Bay. So let's kind of go back just a little bit before then. In 1882, the Sturgeon-Based shipping canal opens. In 1883, Sturgeon Bay becomes a city. So things are really happening. Sturgeon Bay merges with the town of Sawyer, which was now west side of Sturgeon Bay. And Moses, who had been, moving slowly north, is now operating a business in Sturgeon Bay. I think he saw the opportunity. There's growth there. There's things happening. There's shipping. There's a rail line. He already has experience in operating a store, in shipping grains. So in 1893, Isidore and Fanny, they sell their store, they sell everything in Milwaukee, and they move to Sturgeon Bay, where he is now going to become an employee of his father-in-law, Moses Teweles. So Moses is 28 years older than Isidore, but Isidore is no slouch. Soon after relocating to Sturgeon Bay, they become partners. So he's not just an employee anymore. He's a partner of this business. These two men, who were immigrants from the end of a feudal society, now own 2 large grain elevators. They're conducting a wholesale grain trade. They've enlarged their warehouse. They're owners of 10 acres of land and several lots in the 3rd ward of the city. They also built and own the docks that are leased by the Sawyer Lumber Company. And Isidore is known around town for really being a smart guy, thoroughly studying the grain trade. He knows about crops, he knows about buying, he knows about sales and shipping, and has really established himself among the leading grain merchants. He is a mover and a shaker. This picture shows an aerial view of the Sturgeon Bay waterfront. This was a 1925 Army Corps of Engineers lake survey map. But it shows the location of the Teweles and Brandeis granary and warehouses. So it's enlarged in this picture right here. So here's where the current granary is, right here. These were the warehouses that are there no longer, and the docks. There were 4 granaries in Sturgeon Bay at that time. So this was the 3rd one. The first one was on the east side, 2nd granary on the west side, 3rd granary was the Teweles and Brandeis granary, and then the 4th granary. So interestingly enough, you can see how the rail came in on one side and ships could come in on either side. There's an overview here to the screen on the right that shows that position kind of juxtaposed over a more current picture. You can see how the water used to come in and really surround this area much more, if you look at both sides. So it was really, that was a pier that kind of stuck out into the bay. So that area where like the Maritime Museum sits now is all, you know, fill in from the lake. So this picture shows that same view, but kind of from the, you know, from the ground level. So you're looking at the granary, you're looking at the shipping and the docks and the warehouses. And I believe we were thinking that early 1900s based on the boats that are in the harbor. So looks a little bit different today. So meanwhile, Isidore and Fanny really realized their dream. They're very successful. There's articles about their business in the paper. They've really become involved in creating the community we know as Sturgeon Bay. Isidore takes advantage of many opportunities that were not afforded to him in Czechoslovakia. Even his ability to seek out knowledge about the trades, you know, in his home country, that was knowledge from the guilds, right? Like you had to be a part of the guild to have that. So they put down roots and they built their lives in Sturgeon Bay. They commissioned an architect to design a house, and they built it in a very prominent location on Lawrence Street, what was Lawrence Street, which is now 528 Michigan. So you've probably driven by it and seen it. Maybe someone lives there on this call. Isidore, he's really embracing it all. He becomes a member of the Masons, the Modern Woodmen, and the Odd Fellows. These are all organizations that still exist today. He becomes a citizen, and we have his passport. I've seen his passport request. So I wondered, did he use that? Did he get his passport to be able to go back to the old country? We don't know, but all, you know, very interesting. And I'd love to dig deeper and find more information on that. He also served as alderman. He was the police commissioner for 9 years. He was a huge proponent of the public library system. He did fundraising for that for 5 years. I also read something that he fought against taking tainted money for the library. And I'm wondering if that was a reference to Carnegie's library program where he granted money to the communities. Some folks weren't a fan of Carnegie. So another area, there's so many aspects of this story that I think we could dig into to really understand more. Beyond just Moses and Isidore, there's other members of their families that came here, that worked with them, that lived with them, that shared that same dream and realized it in different ways. So there was Jonas Leopold Brandeis. He was Isidore's uncle. He was the merchant in Manitowoc at the same time as Moses Teweles, so could be a connection of how Isidore met the Teweles family. He founded Brandeis and Sons, which was the huge department store chain in Nebraska. And very successful, had a large family that have done all sorts of things across the United States. They sold to Yonkers in 1986, and unfortunately we know what happened then, but he was also one of the pioneers of the modern shopping mall. Other members of the family that were successful included his son. Unfortunately, his son Emil was born in Manitowoc, was traveling on the Titanic when it docked at Cherbourg, France. So he and his friend and his friend's wife, they got her into the lifeboat. And then they waited on the deck and said, well, you know, told her as they got her in, we'll be with you shortly, don't worry. His body was recovered. They found his pocket watch, and that watch has even been in display in museums with Titanic displays. Louis Brandeis was a Supreme Court justice from 1916 to 1939. He was a distant cousin of Isidore's. He was really known as a militant crusader for social justice, and they called him dangerous because he was incorruptible. So I like that. On the Teweles side, the son of Moses, Fanny's brother, went to Kellnersville, Sheboygan, and ended up in Milwaukee. He was selling chicken feathers, seeds, and feed. He started a produce building. And then he founded the L. Teweles Seed Company, which is transporting seeds. But the thing he did is he then started packaging and selling those seeds himself. So his company became the second largest forage seed company in North America. And Hugo Teweles was his son. He built the tallest building on the south side of Milwaukee. And he was a little bit of a marketing genius. He took those seeds, which were used to be just a commodity, and he branded them, gave them levels of grade, and called them different things, so that that really helped the company take off even more. So their story, the Teweles and Brandeis story, kind of brings us to our granary. And we've recently rebranded it the Door County Granary because it's the last granary left in Door County, which used to have, Sturgeon Bay had 4, I believe Door County had 8. But it'll forever be known as the 1901 Teweles and Brandeis Granary. One of the quotes that I love is by John Sawhill. In the end, our society will be defined not only by what we create, but by what we refuse to destroy. And I think that's a perfect quote for Preservation Month in Wisconsin. Our granary, it was built in 1901. It was strategically located at the intersection of roads, rail lines. I'm sorry, I think my system isn't keeping up with my screen, but there was strategically located at an intersection of roads and rail lines. There were the shipping docks. Before the grain could actually be distributed, it had to be weighed, it had to be sorted, cleaned, measured, stored, and then finally sold. So as we already know, Moses and Isidore saw this need, and they really helped Sturgeon-Based Waterfront become a hub of commerce and distribution. So alongside the granary and the warehouses were a brewery, a dairy, a cherry plant, a cherry processing plant, other warehouses and farm-related structures. But of all of those things that built our community, only the Teweles and Brandeis grain elevator survives. This picture, we think, is about 1936. You can see the steel bridge in there, which was opened in 1931. And our granary is right in the middle, just south of the bridge. So striking in its simplicity, the granaries are often referred to as prairie sentinels or prairie cathedrals, and you can see that. The granary is all straight lines, it's right angles, it measures 40 feet by 50 feet, rises to a height of 75 feet. When it's full, or when it was full, it could hold up to 30,000 bushels of grain in the vertical bins. 19 of the bins held grain, as we talked about a little bit earlier. The 20th space had the conveyor system and the man lift, propelled by a counterweight. And once there were, 4 granaries that stood like those prairie sentinels, watching the life of our town and our community today. And we still have one left that's standing watch by the bay. In October 11th, 1902, the edition of the Door County Advocate noted that the liveliest place out of the business streets is down at the elevator, where hundreds of teams are to be found daily, delivering products off the farm. The farmers never had such a cinch as they have this year, and they all appreciate the fact too. Everyone loves a lighthouse. They're romantic. They remind us of our seafaring history. I don't believe many of us look at granaries in the same way, but we should. They remind us of our agricultural heritage, immigrants and settlers moving west to homesteads in Wisconsin, farmers laboring all year, spending long days, sleepless nights, harvesting, them bringing their crops to town with lots of questions and hopes in their mind. You know, what was the final yield? What price would it bring? Was the quality as good as our neighbors? And then in addition to grain being exchanged, it was a time to socialize and exchange news. Had the newest seeds or planting method worked? Who was new in town? Who was getting married, having a baby? It was an event. You saw your neighbors, you caught up, you brought supplies for the upcoming winter. Granaries, these sentinels of the prairie, they're simplicity, they're honest, and they are romantic. And unfortunately, they're disappearing at an alarming rate. So what happened? Why are, what happened to the country elevators? Why are they disappearing? Virtually none of the original grain elevators remain on the Great Lakes. And the ones that you see across the prairie are in various states of decay, disrepair, or demolition, being torn down. There were two major factors that contributed to the decline of the country grain elevator. One was the creation of the interstate highway system, and the other, the modern grain silo. So William J. Brown, who wrote the book American Colossus about grain elevators, said that the country grain elevators in the prairies were abandoned and left to rot as a result of the immense changes that, during and after World War II, took place in the way that the Northern American grain trade was organized, chiefly the use of trucks operating on the interstate highway system instead of train lines to transport grain. The evolution of the modern grain silo, where farmers could easily store their own grain, also enabled them to transport their grain by truck to the larger terminal elevators, which were becoming modernized, constructed in cement, and that had a bigger capacity of tens of millions of bushels. So essentially, these old country grain elevators just kind of went out of disuse, or went out of use. So why do we feel that it's so important to save this grain elevator, to save our granary? I think first, buildings like these give a community a sense of place. It's not traditionally beautiful, what you would think of as beautiful, but it is beautiful nonetheless. The craftsmanship is incredible. It has a really recognizable and distinguished silhouette on the skyline. I was talking to someone, and this might be far-fetched, but if you think of Notre Dame Cathedral and its silhouette on Paris, it has that same effect, maybe more in line with something like covered markets or walled cities in older cities. But it's those parts of our history that make us who we are and that make us unique. Secondly, this building is the last vestige of the people, the companies, the industries that helped build Sturgeon Bay. This area was bustling in commerce. The cherry plant, the processing plant, the dairy, the brewery, railway, shipping. Really, this is the last building that is the reminder left from that time. And thirdly, we are in a unique position to save it. As a tourist destination, we have the people that are coming here that we could build this, have as a monument to our agricultural heritage. It's in the heart of the community. We could use this as a community space, and I'll talk a little bit about the design. Granaries have been around for thousands of years, but the grain elevator, which really revolutionized the food industry, is an American invention. And you used to see these dotted across the landscape. Each community used to have one. It was the heart of the community, but every year more and more disappear. And we have been doing a lot of research, and we believe that this grain elevator, our Door County Granary, may be the last of its kind on the Great Lakes, which used to have hundreds, if not thousands. Let's talk about what we're going to do. What's our plan? First, we really needed to take on a strong team, to build a strong team to take on this project. We're not doing it alone. So we have put together the Sturgeon Bay Historical Society, the City of Sturgeon Bay, our architect, LaDalman, Smet Construction, Silman Engineering, GEI Consultants, and the Door County Community Foundation is helping with our fundraising, help us manage our fundraising efforts. So we've got a good core team behind us. We had, some of you may have heard of some big donations that were made to the Greenery previously. And that was money that was given to help us rehabilitate the Greenery and make it a viable, vibrant part of our waterfront community again. We had to use part of that money, a lot of that money, to save the Greenery, moving it twice. And went across the bridge, so adding to its historical value. It's probably one of the only granaries that's ever moved across the bridge. And it did it twice. So along with that, there's been so many things that have been going on behind the scenes. So maybe it looks like nothing's happening with the Greenery. It's down there, but we've worked hard to get it listed on the National and State Historic Register. We've got the teams together to do the design and the construction. The foundation engineering plans have been completed. There was a GEI laser scan. We believe this to be potentially one of the only granary of its types that have had a full GEI laser scan, which essentially shows you exactly how the granary was constructed, every board, every nail. It was cleaned from top to bottom. So this picture in the upper right-hand corner is inside one of those grain bins. So that was someone that was going in, they're in that white suit, kind of rappelling down, cleaning out the grain bin. So clean top to bottom. We had the agreement with the city finalized, engaged with the Door County Community Foundation to help us with our fundraising, and we've established several teams within our group to help us moving forward with our rehabilitation of the Greenery. One great thing that happened recently was that the actual design of the Greenery, working with our architect LaDalman, they submitted this design for an international award. This was the 68th year of this particular award for architecture. And the Greenery was one of 6 out of 125 international submissions, one of 6 winners. And other people located in Toronto, New Orleans, Uganda, Los Angeles, North Carolina. So it was very exciting, not only for the Greenery, but for the city of Sturgeon Bay to have a design on this particular structure that will be internationally recognized, and just another attraction of the Greenery that will bring people to Sturgeon Bay to see it when it's completed, something we can really be proud of. So if we look for the evolution of the design, we talked about the silhouette. It's striking, it's recognizable. We can look at it from the early 1900s, and then we see a picture from the early 2000s. It's maintained its form. The vision that we have for the Greenery really keeps that form and vision. So it keeps the simplicity. It really pays homage to our agricultural heritage. And yet creating a space that it can become a vibrant part of the community. Once again, people will be there exchanging news, meeting in town, all those things that happened at the turn of the last century. So how will this all happen? Well, we have a phased rehabilitation plan. Phased for construction and fundraising purposes. So for phase 1, we have a commitment to the city that the Greenery will be new foundation and pilings. It'll be returned to its original location, and that's very important in order for us to keep its historic status. The first floor needs to be rebuilt. We've saved the original beams. Those will be reinstalled in a lot of the original wood. So it'll be as close to the original Greenery as possible. Lighting will be installed. We're going to have in-floor heat and big ground floor windows so that space can be opened up and people can move. We could have markets in there, various different uses for the community. And then we'll be building an attached structure, and that structure will kind of be reminiscent of the trains that used to pull up to the granary to take the grain away. So that structure will house a bathrooms and a mechanical room and catering kitchens. So that's going to be our phase one. We need to have that in order to meet our agreement with the city to have that space. And that's what we're doing right now and fundraising for right now. Our second phase will be the second floor to modify the mezzanine and the walkways. And maybe I'll walk through some of the pictures and that'll get a better idea of what's going to happen in like each of these phases. So this picture shows a crosscut of the granary. And so you can see that first floor opened up, the original beams being back installed to hold up the bins, which are on that second story and the second floor above. So all of that first floor space and the additional building, that's all part of phase one. Phase two will then begin looking at the second floor. So carving out some space from the bins to kind of create a meeting area or a small gathering space. And then having walkways that would meander through the bin space, which we envision will be space to have some of the interpretive history of the granary. We have a lot, the old wheel, we've got a lot of the original mechanisms from the granary, and eventually go all the way up to the top to the head house. So if we look at just an interior picture of the first floor, part of our phase one design, would be to have just this very nice open space. Markets, weddings, different people coming in, art installations, and having those windows that could open and close up to the, up and bring light in from the bay. For phase two, that's where we'd be looking at carving out some more of the bin space, creating a smaller gathering area on the second floor, on the mezzanine levels, and then also walkways, you know, just bringing people through the space and having them understand how the granary actually operated and worked. And then finally, up to the head house. And that would, this is the current design plan is as envisioned. It would have a corrugated polycarbonate and be open so that you could see views of the surrounding bay. We have lots of ideas for uses. Our first and primary use is to really create an education center on our agricultural history. But there will be space, so there will be public use, open for everyone, and then we will have the ability to have private events in the space as well. And the private events, we are hoping to help fund the use of the public space. So holiday markets, local festivals, you know, yoga, theater events. So these are all things that we're looking at to help us really create a cultural center for the community. We've looked at some floor plan and seating layouts just to see how this, make sure that this space could be used in those ways that we are envisioning. We are also embarking on a project, as I've said earlier, we've already been doing this research project, and we're really trying to establish if this truly is the last granary of its type, the original grain elevator on the Great Lakes. If you can see, you know, there's lots of space around the Great Lakes. Our little area of Door County, you know, had eight granaries in itself. Sturgeon Bay had 4. So you can imagine the amount of granaries that were here at one time. In Buffalo, New York, over by Lake Erie, that's where one of the original, that's where the original grain elevator was invented and developed, and it no longer exists. They have small, like miniature scale models of it, but there's nothing there. We've been looking, calling, going to historical societies all around these states around the Great Lakes and have been unable to find any other one. We think this may be the last one. There was one in Duluth, in Superior, on Lake Superior, but in 2018, it was in the process of being dismantled, and it ended up burning down. So this could be the last vestige of what was a huge industry, and builder of all these towns and industry across America and the Great Lakes. So we are looking for volunteers if anyone would like to help us in that project. You can always reach out to us, and we would appreciate any help to confirm our findings. So with that, I'd just like to say a quote from Richard Moe, that preservation is simply having the good sense to hold on to things that are well designed, that link us with our past in a meaningful way, and that have plenty of good use left in them. So we have our website, doorcountygranary.org. You can definitely join our effort and watch our progress there. We have a video that was created for us by our architect firm that really talks about the history of Sturgeon Bay and this project. That's well worth watching as well. So I'm open if there's any questions, Laura or Stephen. I'm happy to answer any questions if I can, or maybe somebody has any stories that they could tell about the granary.
Well, there's one question here in the chat for you, Beth, right away. Chesla asks, I was speaking with Jackie Stroh a few years ago, and she believes that there was a Teweles family who lived in her house on the corner of Kentucky Street and North 6th Avenue. Do you know if there was a connection there?
I don't know. I would assume if it was the Teweles family, there probably was a connection to Moses and his family. He had 6 children. So I'm sure some of them were located in this area. But I would love to, I'd love to get that information and can dig into it and find out more. Thanks, Tressa.
You could go to the Register of Deeds and check the tract file to see ownership of property through time. That would be one way to do it.
All right.
Does anyone else have any questions for Beth? I have a technical question. If somebody was to try to start helping with the research to figure out if this was the last grain elevator on the Great Lakes, just in theory, of course, is there a particular technical name for this style of granary that we're looking for?
I believe there is, and I can find that out for you, Stephen. It's Perfect. I'm not on the tip of my tongue, but yeah, it's based on the original design by Joseph Dart. So they called it the Dart elevator then, but that's what it's typically called at this point.
Okay, thank you.
Nobody wants to know why it's granary and not granary. For sure somebody would ask that question.
Anyone grammar minded?
I'd like to know.
Yeah.
Well, and I looked that one up just in case, Laura. The word granary was adapted in English in the 16th century, and it comes from the Latin word granarium. If someone speaks Latin, you can correct me, I don't know. So then I thought, okay, so they took that, it was, GRAN versus there was no I in there, but then why don't we call it gran instead of grain, right? Like, why are we doing that? And it's because the word grain, GRAIN, was adopted in the 13th century from the French word for grain, which the French had already adopted from the Latin, and changed it into French. So that's why we have grain, but yet we have granaries. So makes complete sense.
Do we have any idea when construction's going to start on the foundation?
Well, that depends on some of our fundraising efforts, as well as we're working very hard with our architect and the construction company. We actually have our architect coming this weekend for some meetings with the construction company and the engineering firm. So we don't have any we don't have any exact dates. We are counting on the generosity of some people as well to move us forward to that point. But we are moving as quickly and as soon as possible. We know we need to, we don't have any time to waste if we want to make sure that we can preserve this building.
And there's another question from Nicola. Is the granary built from original growth wood? Can you explain something about the wood?
It is. It is old growth timber. It came from, and I don't have the exact location, and Nikki might even know, but I believe it's across the bay from the Michigan side. That's where the timber came from. So I can find out and I'll add that in more, but it's definitely old growth lumber. So it's solid. The grain bins it is a very solid building. And you can see, if you look at the side of the granary on this picture, you can actually see, so it's 40 by 50, and each of the grains is 10 foot, the grain bins is 10 foot by 10 foot. So imagine those solid timbers, old growth timbers, framing out inside of that building, even, you know, stacked one on top of the other to create the bins. There's pictures on or videos on YouTube that show granaries being demolished by communities that aren't valuing them or don't have a way to repurpose them. And they're hard to even destroy at that point. A lot of them have burned because the granary process with the dry grain was very flammable. So we're very lucky to have this bit of history in our community. And one of the reasons that we do have it is because that area was undeveloped for a long time and was kind of skipped over. And so we are truly lucky to have this piece of history here.
Sorry, go on.
Is the granary, is it located exactly where it's going to be, or does it have to be moved, adjusted on the location?
It has to be adjusted on the location, Tom. So it's going to move back probably about 50 feet from where it's sitting now. So they'll be digging the foundation and putting in the pilings because we have to have it sit on pilings there. And then it will be, the first floor will be rebuilt and it'll be set on top of the original timbers.
Oh, that should be interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'll watch that.
Yeah, it'll be something to see. The history on this granary, even with, you know, watching it like move across the bridge and back and now, you know, move back into place, it's pretty fascinating.
A few years ago, some of the ancestors or the descendants of the Brandeis and Teweles family came to town and spoke. Is there any chance they'll be coming back?
We hope so. We're reaching out to them just to kind of keeping them informed as to what's happening, and we would love to have, you know, when we do our what do they call it when you dig when you start the dig with the, you know, the first
groundbreaking.
There you go, groundbreaking. When we do the groundbreaking ceremony to start moving back. So it would be great to have them here as a part of that as well, to have that continuity from, you know, the family that built it to the family that's, you know, have them there that when it's returning to its original location.
Are there any other questions?
I have a question, Beth. Nice job. How much higher will the granary be when we put it back on its original foundation and put the first floor back?
It'll be, the entire granary will be 75 feet tall. I'm not exactly sure of the dimensions of the first floor, but the first floor was pretty, you know, it had a high ceiling to it.
Sure.
So I'm not sure what the exact dimensions was of that, if it's 12 feet or something like that, but the whole building when done will be 75 feet tall. And that was my husband. So thanks for the good job.
And so I think it's really beautiful to see the view from up there. It's going to be a little dwarfed by that tower next door. But will it be open? Do you have any plans of who will be able to go there? And you said it will be possibly rented for weddings and things like that.
Yeah, so our plan is to have the whole granary open for the public, to be able to go to the top to the head house. It's part of our phase one, our initial phase one. We need to just kind of get it to where it needs to go and get it going and operational. And then we will continue with the second floor and up. So the granary, next couple of years have a grand opening. We'd have the grand opening for the initial part of it moving back and the reestablishment of the floor, which will make it operational. And then kind of the next phase of building up. Its 125th birthday would be in 2026. We hope to have the whole thing open way before then, but yeah, the whole thing, Laura, will be open to the public.
Well, are there any other questions? Well, thank you, Beth. That was really interesting. I have to look into more of that history.
I could have gone down a million different paths as I was researching, and it was just granaries itself, the family, our granary, and it really made me, I knew I loved this building. I know it was important in our community, but the fact that it was part of what made America become the breadbasket to the world and a cultural superpower. There's just so many aspects to this granary that keep showing themselves that really make it special.
Yes, and I think, the whole idea that the trains came into the granary and ships also is pretty interesting. There's quite an interesting history there in Sturgeon-Based of the big wars they had between the two groups. So it sure is the center where everybody meets.
Yeah, I started to go into that too, and I'm like, that could be a whole nother session. So maybe we'll just do a whole series of granary talks.
Okay, we'll all be watching as it develops. And thank you again.
Thanks, Laura. Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you, Beth.
Bye.
Bye-bye.